As you can see, I've packed all of my books except for the finest of reading materials. We'll do book club on those later. Good evening and welcome back to fucking book club. Tonight's series is going to be a treat. Never before done in book club. We are covering 2 chapters at once. We are covering chapter 10, A Love Worth Fighting For, and chapter 11, Pressed But Not Crushed. The reason we are doing both chapters at once is because this is basically the point in their story where they almost didn't happen, where Jinger actually rejected him at first. So we need to get into this. I don't know how many parts this is going to be. It's going to be 3-minute videos, so it's going to take a little bit longer to upload. I'm going to try to keep them under 3 minutes and see if that changes anything, but we'll see. So again, both chapters are from both points of view of Jeremy and Jinger, so I'll make sure that we differentiate between who's speaking. Starting with the point of Jeremy, I wasn't sure what to expect when an email from Mr. Duggar showed up in my inbox about a week after my trip to Central America. The email included an attached Word document. I opened it up to find 50 pages of questions. Not 50 questions, 50 pages. This is the courtship questionnaire that I went over months ago. And I'm talking like I had just over 10,000 family members. It's where the highlighter crown was born. I know I'm going to have to move those into a playlist also, and I never finished that questionnaire, so we'll see. My eyes widen as I scroll through what looked like the longest job application I'd ever fill out. He said he wanted to spend some time getting to know me, and this document showed he wasn't kidding. So this confirms that this questionnaire is from the point of Jim Bob. And some of those questions on there are way too personal. Personally, if somebody asked me for the last 3 months of my bank statements, I would tell them to piss off. The questions weren't surface level, and some of them were on topics I had yet considered. He asked me everything from how I became a believer and my position on theological issues, foreshadowing, to my opinions on parenting and how I handle finances. They were the kinds of questions that would save married couples a lot of pain and heartache if they asked them before they walked down the aisle. Although I do agree with that, the questions he asks are too personal. This wasn't something I could knock out in a few minutes. This was serious, and I approached it that way. If Mr. Duggar wanted to know me, if he wanted me to answer all these questions, I'd do it. Oh, we love that. So he goes on to say that he filled out this entire questionnaire during a layover on his way to his parents' house for Christmas. He said he sent it back to him 3 hours after he began it, and that the page count was at 107 pages. So he literally doubled it. He goes on to talk about how over the next couple weeks, him and Jim Boob were talking, usually on Fridays, and at first it was nothing really intense. They mostly discussed answers on his questionnaire. In the Duggars culture, I had to get Mr. Duggar's approval before Jinger and I could start our relationship. I wasn't too concerned about this. I knew this was how Ginger's family operated, and I accepted. We, the people, do not accept that. He says that it was definitely different than asking any other girl out, but that he was hopeful and eager. Jim Boob asked him to come out and visit in mid-January and spend a few days at the Duggars' home. I don't think this was filmed. So Jeremy thought that he was going to be going straight to the big house. He was excited to see Jinger. And of course, Jim Bob had a different itinerary. So we're going to have lunch with my pastor and talk about your theology. He said his eyes never moving from the road. That might be a deal breaker. Kind of speaks volumes, because you can't have everybody who agrees with your opinion. Sorry. And I now, after reading this book, fully understand why Jim Boob gave him such a hard time the entire 3rd season of Counting On. He literally treated him like shit. I did not see that coming. If anything was a stumbling block, I thought it would be my past. I drank and partied in college. I had been arrested. I could understand parents looking at those issues as red flags. We love a bad boy. It had never occurred to me that my theology would be the issue. All I could say was, oh, all right, cool. I wondered what Jinger was doing as we parked in a Cracker Barrel parking lot and headed inside. This day was not turning out the way I thought. Now from the point of Jinger, she talks about how she could barely contain her excitement that Jeremy was coming to visit and that Jim Bob's the one that invited him out. I could barely contain my excitement when Dad told me Jeremy was coming to visit. Me saying Jim Bob as dad is kind of weird. I knew Jeremy had asked him about me and that they were talking regularly over the phone. While we couldn't talk or text, I knew I had fallen hard for him. So was that hug in the airport a secret hug? She spent that entire morning picking out her nicest outfit and making sure her hair looked just right because she wanted to impress Jeremy. She said hours dragged by as if the clock was actually moving backwards. She was trying to keep herself busy in anticipation, but couldn't possibly wonder what was going on for her dad and Jeremy to not be back at the house yet. She even used her Find My Friends location to find out where Jim Boob was. And later, when she saw that they were at Cracker Barrel, then she saw them at their pastor's house. And she was wondering what the hell was going on. Finally, at 5 p.m., they pulled into the driveway, but no car doors open. They still were talking. Jeremy goes on to say that it didn't take him long to realize that there was a lot of theological differences from Mr. Duggar and the church that ran deep. I spent hours laying out my position on theological issues and walking through them passages of the Bible that led me to those positions. But nonetheless, he was still excited to see Jinger and that he knew all this was worth it because it was for Jinger. I knew how precious Jinger was to Mr. Duggar. I knew he was being careful in order to protect her. If I wanted any chance at all in pursuing her, I had to lay it all bare before him. Before he opened the car door, I spoke. Look, Mr. Duggar, I don't deserve your daughter. I don't. She's an incredible woman. She's not gone out and made foolish decisions like I have. While I've wasted years of my life, but I'm a changed man. I'm pursuing Christ. And then Jim Boob responds, I know, Jeremy, I know. I don't deserve her, but I'm asking you to give me a chance. Giselle was like, get your ass in this house. I made dinner. Actually, all my kids did. We're back to the point of Jinger. And she says that the anxiety from the day of waiting has melted away as soon as Jeremy walked through the door, that the tension had gone away, and that she knew that Jeremy wanted to be with her. After he told me about his conversation with the pastor, though, going to church together felt a little strange. I felt awkward as I imagined people staring at us, whispering that he shouldn't be there, that I shouldn't pursue a relationship with him. As excited as I was, it dawned on me that others might not feel the same way about us. If I am uncomfortable, I can only imagine how Jeremy must feel. Part of me wanted to grab him by the shoulders and say, please, please don't go anywhere. So this is interesting because they filmed this on Counting On. Jeremy was there as the TLC crew filmed us building a treehouse in our backyard for an upcoming special featuring Jill and Jessa. Their names were in the title, but I was in the special from the beginning, and the crew visited the big house regularly. No one told the crew about Jeremy's interest in Jinger, and she laughed when the producer asked him to move off of the set that they were on so that they could film. The next day, Jeremy had to fly home because it was a Saturday and Jeremy had church on Sunday. So she spent that morning with him, Ben, Jessa, and Giselle at Mama Carmen's, their favorite coffee place. We had the best time enjoying coffee, laughing together and talking theology at a given if Jeremy and Jessa are together. Mom asked Jeremy such thoughtful questions, and I could tell she really wanted to get to know him. A few of my brothers and my dad were gathered in the kitchen when we walked through the front door. So, Jeremy, one of them said, I have a question for you. Before I realized what was happening, my brothers peppered Jeremy with question after question about theology. He could barely answer before somebody else jumped in with another question and then another. I shrank into myself as I stood rooted to the floor, my eyes darting between my brothers and Jeremy. I knew Jeremy's beliefs weren't exactly the same as ours, but Jeremy loved Christ. He served the Lord and dedicated himself to studying the Word and preaching the gospel. That's all I needed to know. Jeremy handled their questions with grace and humility. He didn't get upset or defensive, and he didn't try to talk over them. He listened and he answered them calmly and patiently. Watching him remain cool in the hot seat made me fall for him even more. As much as it hurt to say goodbye, I felt hopeful as I watched my dad's car disappear down the driveway and onto the road. My family may have asked him questions, but I could see that they liked Jeremy, and I couldn't wait for the day that we could start our relationship. Back to the point of Jeremy. We're still on chapter 10. Mr. Duggar pulled into the drop-off lane in front of the airport and grabbed my bag out of the truck. You know, Jeremy, you're a great guy, he said, standing on the sidewalk, but I don't know about this theology. At that point, Jeremy was like, really? JB knew where Jeremy stood and why Jeremy believed in what he believed in. And if you can't respect that, then shut the fuck up. He goes on to say that he isn't going to disavow his convictions for a girl, but he felt that he needed to clear up a few misconceptions. that Jim Bob had about those convictions. What else was there for him to say? If I wanted to be with Jinger, I knew I was going to have to fight for her, but she was worth it. Over the last few days, I'd seen that I had only begun to discover this sweet, spunky woman. When I was with her, I felt a spark in chemistry I'd never felt with anyone else. If this is what it took to win her heart, then I would give it my all. We'll talk next week then, I said and shook his hand goodbye. He goes on to say that for the next several Fridays, him and Jim Bob had conversations. Jim Bob sent him lectures, and they discussed them on the phone. He goes on to talk about how months went by and he still was not given permission to pursue Jinger, but they had kept up their weekly conversations. Jeremy goes on to say that he visited the big house occasionally and that his feelings grew deeper. He said everything that he had seen and experienced had only reconfirmed time and time again that Jinger was the woman for him. Ben and Jessa were giving him a little hype up, it's gonna be alright, it's gonna be okay, we just gotta keep going with it. After 4.5 months of this bullshit, Jim Bob texted Jeremy one Saturday morning asking for Jeremy's dad's phone number. He said, I knew we were getting somewhere. If he had wanted to talk to his dad, he was closer to giving his blessing for Jinger. And then later on that day, he asked for Jeremy's pastor's phone number. Jeremy's dad told him that they had a great conversation and that Jeremy's mom and Giselle talked for more than 3 hours. Finally, his phone rang and it was Jim Bob. Jeremy, I'm so sorry, Mr. Duggar said after an initial greeting, but I don't think I can let you pursue my daughter. This theology seems to be a deal breaker. In that moment, I was crushed. Was the entire future I'd hoped for with Ginger slipping away? I'd felt so sure she was going to be my wife. How could it all be taken away just like that? I had spent over 4 months talking to Mr. Duggar, explaining my theology and answering questions. I couldn't accept that it was all for nothing. I'd fought all this time for Jinger. I wasn't done fighting, not now, not ever. Mr. Duggar, I said calmly, can we talk about this? Opened their Bibles, and for the next hour, they went through theology. Again, Jeremy explained where he was coming from, and by the end of the conversation, Jim Bob said, okay, Jeremy, let's talk again next week. He's leading him on, into a dark tunnel with no end. Jim Bob told him to call him by the end of the week, and Jeremy called him on Thursday, and when Jim Bob answered cheerfully, there was something he wanted to talk about, and his face broke into a grin, and he knew it was game on, bitches. We're back to the point of Jinger. She goes on to say that the months that Jeremy and Jim Bob were talking wasn't strange to her. She knew that her dad wanted to be comfortable in the person that she would potentially marry, and she was excited that they had all this time to get to know each other. I wonder if Jeremy told her how fucking strenuous it was, because I would have been like, do you know? The more time that went by, the more she realized how many people had different perspectives on Jeremy than she did. Some friends pulled me aside to share their concerns about the wildlife. They were convinced Jeremy must have lived as a single man and professional soccer player. The people who talked to me were well-intentioned and only meant to warn me of what they believed were red flags. Your brother's a red flag, but moving along. All these negative comments about Jeremy was emotionally draining. She was crazy about Jeremy, and she wanted everybody else to appreciate him too. You have to look at the big picture, Ginge, Jessa told me over and over again. She and Ben were my biggest supporters and cheerleaders as my dad continued to talk to Jeremy. You can't expect 18 siblings to all approve of your guy. Someone somewhere is not going to be happy about it. You already know about his past, and it's not nearly as crazy as it could have been. You do not need to worry about that. It's true, Jeremy did have a wild past, but that's because he wasn't sheltered from the outside world. After listening to all the differing opinions, part of me wondered if maybe they were right. What if everyone was telling me the truth and I was making a horrible mistake? What if I entered into a relationship with him only to find out that he wasn't who he said he was? The old fear I'd overcome when I was 14 crept its way back into my heart. I was scared at the idea of starting a relationship with Jeremy and opening myself up to him only for everything to fall apart. Lord, make it clear, I prayed. Make it your will known. So then she was telling herself not to let everybody else's opinions affect her way of thinking. So when my dad told me he invited Jeremy to join us at a conference, I was excited. This was it. Dad was finally ready for us to start a relationship, I thought. Pushing the fear lurking in the back of her head away, I could do this. I was ready. At least I thought it was. Back to the point of Jeremy. Ben and I were making breakfast in the boys' dorm when Mr. Duggar walked in. I smiled when I saw him. The first few days of the conference couldn't have gone better. I had spent time with Jinger, and I went out to lunch with her parents on what felt like a double date. "How's it going, Mr. Duggar?" I asked. He looked like he hadn't slept well. He was still wearing his white undershirt. His eyes were weary with dark circles. I chalked it up to an early morning out. "Jeremy, can I talk to you a minute?" he asked. Something in his tone sent a chill up my spine. "Yeah, sure," I said. I followed him to an empty room and he shut the door. Mr. Duggar turned to me and sighed deeply. "I'm so sorry, Jeremy," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but Jinger said she's not interested. For a moment I felt dizzy. I thought I must have heard him incorrectly. I saw the way Jinger looked at me last night when she told me goodnight. I knew she loved me. I could feel it. There had to be some mistake. But when I saw the tears in Mr. Duggar's eyes, "Why is he fucking crying, you big baby?" I realized he was telling the truth. His words hung in the air like a dark cloud. I felt like I couldn't breathe if I had been punched in the gut. All this time I thought I was trying to win over Mr. Duggar, to convince him that my theology wasn't a problem. I didn't know a much more sinister problem was threatening to tear us apart forever. That's the end of chapter 10, but guess what? We're posting chapter 11 tonight too, baby. So see you in a minute. Now we're on chapter 11. Pressed but not crushed. Starting with the point of Jinger. I was numb as I sat in my empty dorm room, sitting on the bed. I leaned against the dark wooden headboard and closed my eyes. I wanted to feel something, anything, but I couldn't. This is crazy, I thought. What is wrong with me? She goes on to say that over the weekend, that as soon as Jeremy showed up, her and her parents and Jeremy went on like a double date for tacos, and that they literally had the best time. She floated back to her dorm room on a cloud after saying goodbye to him. Then, for reasons I couldn't understand, something shifted. As I talked to Mom and Dad that night, I suddenly knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't start a relationship with Jeremy. Something was weighing on me. There were so many conflicting opinions, and I felt like I would divide my family and friends if I had moved forward. If I said yes to Jeremy, I would open the floodgates to other people's opinions and criticism. My heart was hardened. It felt like I wasn't myself, and something beyond my control was happening. Now, as I knew Dad was telling Jeremy the bad news, I couldn't even bring myself to feel empathy for him. The room seemed, even though it was morning. Why can't I like him now, I thought. I've wanted this for so long, all this time. I look forward to this moment. Why can't I go through it? Michelle and Jessa asked her what had changed, and she said that she didn't know, but she knew she couldn't do it. Gingy! From the point of Jeremy, Jeremy goes on to say he got in his car and he got on the highway. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed to get the frick out of there. Anger and confusion overwhelmed me. I had fallen victim to the ultimate bait and switch. I totally 100% see why Jeremy felt that way. He had been working for months dealing with Jim Bob's dumbass to get to Jinger. Not get to Jinger, but to be able to court her. My thoughts were interrupted by my phone vibrating in my pocket. It was Ben. "Dude, what is going on?" he asked. Jinger said no. He convinced me to come back to the campus and pick him up. I sat dejected as he climbed in the car. "Let me talk to her," Jessa said. "There's got to be a way we can fix this." I shrugged, "Sure, but I've got to get out of here." So Ben and him took off and they drove around for like an hour and a half. They went to, of all places, a cemetery. On their way home, they stopped for coffee, and he asked Ben to take a picture of him because he had been on a journey. When they got back to campus, they found a bewildered Jessa. She couldn't understand what was going on with Jinger and why Jinger doesn't want to go forward at this point. Jeremy says, "I made my mind up right then that I wasn't leaving. If she had said, 'He's a jerk and I don't like him,' I'd be hurt, but I'd understand." But to hear that she was confused and couldn't do it told me there was hope. If there was some kind of misunderstanding, it was nothing that couldn't be overcome. He goes on to compare like this to a game of soccer, and that he didn't stop for his soccer career and he wasn't going to stop now. Back to the point of Jinger. Wow. Back to the point of who knows. I could hear Jeremy in the hall talking to my parents. "Can I talk to her?" I heard him say. I didn't move from the bed, the same place I'd been sitting and thinking for quite some time now. "Sure," I heard my dad say. "It can't hurt." Jeremy walked through the door looking somber as if he had come from a funeral. I waited as he sat down at the writing desk next to the bed. "What's going on, Jinger?" His voice was calm but sad. "I don't know," I said flatly. "I just can't do it." "Can you tell me why?" "We both want this. We both been moving towards this for so long." "I don't know," I said. "I'm sorry." "You don't have a reason at all?" "I felt like our relationship would cause division," I shrugged. "I don't want to do that." Jeremy looked at me with tears in his eyes, his broken heart written all over his face. "Jinger, I'm willing to fight for you, even if it means I'm fighting against you." That's a scandal. I didn't know what to say. It was the last thing I expected to hear from a guy I'd basically rejected for no reason. Sometimes I need that, I said. Ginger goes on to talk about how Jeremy walked away angry, but her whole life she had bent over backwards for people to make other people happy. She was always the child that wanted to please the Meech and the Jim Bob, who went with the flow, who was the friend that walked on eggshells. The idea of starting a relationship with someone when I knew that perhaps some in my community wouldn't approve was too much. I knew that given how I was feeling, there was no way I could move forward with the relationship, and I hated it. Back to the point of Jeremy. I have never felt so betrayed in my life, I wrote in my journal early Wednesday morning. I'd barely slept the night before in the dorm room where I was staying. I stuck around refusing to give up on Ginger even when it looked hopeless to everyone else. He continues to write in his journal that he was confused as to what Ginger was confused about. And at that point when he was writing in her journal, Gingy walked into the communal living room. Oh, I heard someone say. I stopped writing and looked up. It was Ginger. For a moment, I'd hoped she'd come talk. Instead, she said, I need to practice before the conference. She nodded towards the upright piano against the wall. Everything in her tone of voice said, you're still here. No apology, no hint of remorse. All right, I said, I'll move. I picked up my Bible and journal without saying another word and walked to another room. Sitting on a couch next to a window, I could hear Ginger playing hymns lightly and beautifully as if nothing was wrong. She obviously wasn't bothered by shooting me down and shattering. Cold-hearted, I wrote. Somebody called TMZ. Ginger's cold-hearted as fuck. Back to the point of Ginger. A little later that morning, Jana picked her up to take her to the main campus of the conference, and she immediately burst into tears. As we drove, I couldn't help but think how sad Jeremy looked when I walked into the room that morning, and it hit me what I was really losing when I said no to him. It was the first time in my life I had felt overcome with emotion since I told my parents how I felt. The tears were actually a relief. At least I wasn't numb and cold anymore. She had to get herself together because she had to perform on the piano at the main part of the conference. And she played her heart out. Every emotion she had bottled up for the last few days came pouring out of her into her music, which we all know she's good at piano. By the time that she finished, she was drained and she thought that Jeremy was probably on his way home. Back to the point of Jeremy. And there are photos in this. I can go over them probably towards the end of the book. This is too important right now. We have to get through this. That same morning, as soon as Jeremy sat down at the kitchen table, Ben and Jessa came by to eat breakfast. And while they were still sitting together and talking, so did Jim Bob and Meech. Can we sit down? Jim Bob said. Their wooden chairs scratched against the white kitchen tile as they pulled them away from the table to sit down. Mr. Duggar and I looked at each other, our 5 months of conversations and theological debate hanging heavy over our heads. By now we could see I wasn't going anywhere. I'd stuck around even when the situation looked hopeless, and after all these months of talking, Jim Bob and I still had a lot to discuss. Neither of us said it, but our faces said, okay, let's hash this all out. And we did. We sat down at that table around 8 a.m. and didn't move until after 3. For hours, we opened our Bibles and combed through scriptures. I answered every question they had about my position on God's sovereignty. We spent about 3 hours on one of my favorite passages. 2 Corinthians 5, the love of Christ constrains us, I began. You're always using that word, Mr. Duggar said, constrain. Have you noticed that? Where does it come from? I was so engrossed in our conversation that I didn't hear footsteps in the hall. Hey, Ginge, I heard Mrs. Duggar say. I looked up to find her standing in the doorway, stunning in her long black dress. Peeping, more like it. Why don't you sit down and chat with us, Mrs. Duggar said, pulling out a chair. To my surprise, she sat down. This was my chance to set her at ease and put her fears to rest. I could explain to them once and for all what I believed and how it was grounded in scripture. I didn't want to leave that table until Ginger was confident that we could walk forward together. From the point of Ginger, she could not believe that Jeremy was still there. Like, you lucky bitch. Like, yeah. Who gets rejected and sticks around, she thought. There at that table, I could feel the wall I'd built around my heart coming down. As he talked, a peace slowly washed over me. All the fear, all the oppression I'd felt in my soul began to melt away. I no longer felt the cold contempt that I had felt for him the day before. I wasn't fully myself again, but I wanted to hear what he had to say. She goes on to talk about how she opened up about how she was feeling. She was afraid she would divide her family, afraid she'd divide her brainwashed community. He finally told her that she could trust him and that if he could go back and change his past, he would, but his past is what defines him as a person now. He said, ask me anything and I'll tell you the truth. The 4 of them stayed locked in that conversation for hours. I had been afraid that Jeremy's different theology would push away the people I loved, but I remembered that Jeremy's views were grounded in scripture. He loved Christ. I didn't need to be frightened of what anyone else thought. Some people I cared about might not approve, but I wouldn't be alone. The Lord had brought us together, and he would see us through. As we walked, I realized that the fears that have griped me were no different from the fears that used to keep me awake at night as a young girl. The answer now was the same as it had been back then. I had to trust the Lord. I couldn't get lost in the what-ifs that threatened to cripple me. I had to take that first step in faith, knowing I couldn't sink as long as I kept my eyes fixed on Christ. Back to the point of Jeremy. Jinger didn't change her mind that day for Jeremy, but he could see the Lord working in her. She didn't shut him out. She didn't not engage in conversation. And they all agreed to meet back in the kitchen that next afternoon. He wasn't sure what he would expect when he arrived. He sat down to Jim Bob in a session that morning when they attended another session with several members of the Duggar family. He noticed that Michelle and Jim Bob made a beeline to the back of the room as soon as it ended without so much of a see you later. They're running from the load. When Jinger and her parents walked back into that kitchen, Mrs. Duggar's eyes were puffy as she had been crying. Well, I'd be crying too if I had to listen to Jim Bob all day, but that's not what this is about. They had picked up their conversation from the day before and talked for at least 2 hours before Jim Bob sat back in his chair as he had something to say and said, "Several things have happened. Jeremy, before I met you at session this morning, I walked behind a young man whispering, 'Come thou fount,' to himself. The only line he's saying were the words, 'Daily I'm constrained to be.' I thought it was interesting that he's saying that word after I commented on you saying it all the time. Michelle and I sought counsel with 2 pastors we trust before we came to this conference. Both of us advised us not to make your doctrine an issue. After a session today, we asked another pastor for his advice. I told him of our dilemma, and he asked, 'What does the young man offer a sinner?' Mr. Duggar's eyes filled with tears as he said, 'I told him he offers Jesus.' I stared at Mr. Duggar in awe of what God had done. I understood that this was his way of giving his blessing. 5 months ago, I hadn't believed that this moment was possible. There were so many times that it would have been easier to give up when the mountain ahead of me seemed insurmountable. I can't say big words. 'What do you think, Ginge?' Mr. Duggar said, turning to Jinger. 'Is this the real deal?' My heart pounded as I stared at Jinger, waiting for a response. 'Do you want to do this?' Mr. Duggar asked. I was overwhelmed with joy as she nodded yes again. 2 years ago, the future I thought I had with Jinger had been ripped away from me. Now relief flooded my body, releasing the tension I had carried since the moment Mr. Duggar asked if he could speak with me. I gazed at Jinger with a love I had only prayed for. That night, the 4 of them went out for a steak dinner. I, too, like a steak dinner. As they talked about spending the next day together, she started to feel regret. She knew that Jeremy was amazing. She knew this is where she needed to be. For the first time in a long time, she was excited about her life. She was excited for her new relationship, and that this was a true gift from God. But to me, this screams that Jim Bob had a lot to do with the fact that this almost didn't happen. And I get it, religion, and I understand that. No matter what came our way in the months ahead, I knew we could withstand any test. And that's the end of chapters 10 and 11. This chapter was very important because it kind of gave us an insight as to why Jim Bob was super hard on Jeremy their entire courtship. You could tell that Jim Bob plays a very big role, or did, in his daughter's courtships, and that he takes it very seriously, which I could understand. But something that I took out of these 2 chapters is that in Jim Bob's eyes, you have to follow his convictions and his way of thinking and his theological debates and not let people be themselves for who they are. Jeremy comes from a very normal past, right? Like, he's been to college, he got arrested, he's drank alcohol. But that doesn't take away from what kind of person he is since then. He's learned from his mistakes. He's grown from his mistakes. And it sucks that it took Jim Bob 5 months to see that. See ya next time for chapter 12, called Going the Distance.